Hi, Lighthouse Church. I want to welcome you back to our study in the 7 last sayings of Jesus from the cross. Today we're looking at the 5th statement from the cross, and I'm glad you've chosen to join me. I believe these sets of devotions will help us to get our hearts ready for Easter, even as we are still quarantined at home, still going to be quarantined on Easter Sunday. At least these thoughts will give us something to think about. They'll put the cross, I hope, into real perspective for you, perhaps give you some new insights into what happened there, and not only new insights, but to just reinforce the teachings of the cross and the effect they have on us as Christians. So why don't we go ahead and let's get started. Today, we are again in the book of John where we were yesterday. If you remember, we talked yesterday about how the last 4 statements that Jesus makes from the cross all take place within a space of about no more than 10 minutes. The darkness that descended at noon has dissipated because it's 3 o'clock. This is the time of the afternoon sacrifice in the temple. How very symbolic, but how very prophetic that Jesus himself will be dying at exactly the same hour as that afternoon sacrifice. Yesterday, we looked at his statement, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And the relationship that it had to Psalm 22. Today, we're seeing a little bit of the effects of that because we move from a challenge that Jesus makes to his hearers, to those who have crucified him, to think about the words of the psalm, how it sounds like God has abandoned him, but the psalm ends with a cry of victory, a cry of hope, and that's what he's doing. But now, as I said, we come to the last few minutes of his time on the cross. He's been on there for almost 6 hours now, and that takes a toll on a person. It's time we consider just for a few minutes before we look at those words, what it means to be crucified. In this case, it's good to know that one of the real agonies of crucifixion, along with the physical agonies, was also the agony of thirst. Something we don't necessarily think about too much, but if you think about it, you understand a person who has been crucified is bleeding. We know the hands have been pierced with the nails. The feet have been pierced by the nails also. So blood is flowing out of Christ, but it's not flowing quickly. It's flowing slowly. So he's not rapidly losing blood, but he's continually losing it. And along with blood loss, one of the things that comes is an intense and ever-growing thirst. And that's what's being reflected on the cross here right now. Because the 5th statement of Christ from the cross is a simple one. I thirst. Just 2 simple words. And if you think about it, it sounds, well, there can't be too much there for us. But there is. There's a whole world of meaning, both physical and spiritual, for each and every one of us. So when you hear those words, I thirst, the first thing you want to remember is that they come from his humanity. Before we go any further, though, let me read the short passage out of the Gospel of John that this comes from. We're looking at John chapter 19, and we'll start at verse 28. After this, Jesus, knowing that all was now finished, said, to fulfill Scripture, I thirst. A jar full of sour wine stood there, so they put a sponge into it and filled it with sour wine and put it on a hyssop branch and held it to his mouth. And so what they're doing is they're giving Jesus some sour wine that will moisten his mouth, that will give him some moisture to put in there. Indeed, that sour wine there wasn't for people who were being crucified. This was a drink that the soldiers would have had with them because it was specifically designed by the Roman army to quench the thirst of their soldiers when they got thirsty. And those of you who have been following along, who know the story of the crucifixion, may remember that right at the beginning of the crucifixion, just before he was nailed to the cross, he was offered wine also. But this was wine mixed with myrrh, and he refused it. You may wonder, what for? The answer is that before the crucifixion, that wine mixed with myrrh that was offered to him was offered not to ease thirst, but it was offered as an anesthetic. The myrrh that was in it was a kind of a drug that would dull the pain. And Jesus, knowing that it was up to him to bear the full weight of our sin, wanted nothing clouding his mind or clouding what was going to happen to him. So he refused it. But now that he's coming to the end, he takes the wine, this time not mixed with myrrh, just the sour wine, vinegar basically, that is given to the soldiers, and he takes that into his mouth. And he does that simply because he's moistening his mouth, because he's going to have two more things to say before he gives up his life. Two more things, and he wants to be able to say them so that they're heard and understood. You remember yesterday it says that when Jesus reached this point, he cried out, my God, meaning he put a lot of energy, a lot of effort into it. And after 6 hours on the cross, that would have taken a lot of energy that he had left out of him, what little that he had there. It also would have taken what little moisture was in his mouth to say those words. So now he says, I thirst. But there's a world of meaning in that statement. There's a world of meaning in that word, I thirst. The first thing is simple. It's a reflection, not of his deity, but of his humanity. How many of you have been thirsty? I know that, speaking from my own experience, I tend to be a runner. Not so much as I used to be, but I've run several distance races. I know what it's like when you're running, how fast you can get thirsty and how dry that you can get. And also, I know how much it can take to restore what water that you have dehydrated out of. So thirst, it can be a very clear, a very painful feeling to have. And that's what he was going through. It's also a reminder, too, that people can go far longer without food than they can without water. When Jesus was in the desert suffering the temptation, he went without food for 40 days. And he was hungry, but it didn't kill him. But they tell you that a person can only go about 3 days without water. And in the situation he's in, it would have been much less. This thirst would have been an overwhelming thing to him by the time he reaches here. And it's a reminder to us of his humanity. This isn't the Son of God crying out, I'm thirsty. This is Jesus, human, crying out, I thirst. And it tells us that he can sympathize with us in our own sufferings. It's a reminder to us that he knows, not by feeling, but by experience, what it's like to suffer. There is no pain that you have been through, whether of illness, whether of spiritual pain, there's none that he has not experienced as deeply. He shares them with you. When you come to him in the midst of your pain, he tells you, I understand, not because he wants to make you feel better, but because he's been there, because he has felt exactly the pain that you're feeling. He knows what it is that you're going through. And it's important to kind of bear that in mind. I would also suggest, though, that there's a deeper meaning here to I thirst. I've said how it emphasizes his humanity, what he's going through, his pain. But you know, there's a spiritual element going on here too. I said that Jesus is coming to the end of his time on the cross. He's just finished that particularly dark 3-hour period when the Father turned his face away. And when he says, I thirst, it is his humanity, but it's also his deity. Because thirst in the Bible quite often refers to spiritual thirst, that thirst that we have for communion with God, for relationship with the Father and with the Son. And Jesus, for the first time in all eternity, has been cut off from that relationship. The thirst that he's feeling is physical, but it's also spiritual. He wants a restoration. He wants his spirit to be quenched by the Father, by his return, by his coming back. So when he says, I thirst, he's speaking to the soldiers. He's speaking to the people around him, but he's also speaking to the Father. And he's saying, I thirst for our relationship. I thirst spiritually for what we have. And I think you can point this out from Scripture. If you go back into the Gospel of John, you can see in John chapter 7 where he tells us that any who come to him seeking him will have their thirst fulfilled. They will be spiritually satisfied. Their thirst will be quenched spiritually. They will have rivers of living water flowing out of them because of that. He tells the woman at the well in John chapter 4 how she's drawing water and that she'll drink it and she'll be thirsty again. But there's water for her right there in the presence of him and who he is that will satisfy her eternally, forever. So when he says, I thirst, he's thirsting for for the relationship he's had with the Father that he wants to be restored. He wants a drink spiritually of the living water that he's talking about, as well as of regular water like we feel. It's a suffering of his humanity that we know that he shares, but it's also a thirst for fellowship that he also shares with us, fellowship with the Father. So find in those words a real depth, if you will. Look beyond just the human feeling that's going on there and sense the spiritual thirst that Jesus is also coming out of. Sense how he's asking the Father to fulfill that. I would suggest also that we have those words, and John himself in his scripture is quick to point them out to us, that he says those words, I thirst, in fulfillment of scripture. Now what he's talking about is he's talking about at least likely Psalm 22 again. You notice how that psalm plays all the way through the statements that we've been going through, how each one has at least some relationship to it. This one is no different. Psalm chapter 22 and verse 15 says this, my strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death. You can feel the dryness in that passage. You can feel how thirsty a person would be. You can feel how the moisture is just wicking out like life, wicking out of him. And indeed, it's not going to be very long before the last part of that, you lay me in the dust of death, comes true. When he's taken off the cross, when he's put in the tomb. But now my tongue sticks to my jaws, and he's getting ready for that. There's also another psalm, though, that this is even more directly related to, and that's Psalm chapter 69 and verse 21. They gave me poison for food, and for my thirst, they gave me sour wine to drink. That's very clearly a reference to what's going on the cross. And if you're saying to yourself, well, what poison did they give him in his food? It's talking about that first offer of wine, the wine mixed with myrrh just before the crucifixion. They offered that to him because the myrrh in there was in large quantities a poison. In small quantities, it can help dull pain. But mixed with the wine, he wanted none of it. He did not want to ease any of the suffering he was going to be going through on our behalf. But now, the sour wine, the vinegar, that is what they offer him to drink, not even just plain water. So you see that we have a testament in these words to Christ's humanity and the way he shares our suffering. We see a testament, too, to the spiritual side of Christ that longs for the fellowship of the Father that has been broken, that thirsts for it, just like we thirst for the presence of the Son in our lives. It reminds us that prophecy is fulfilled in the cross, and almost every statement that Christ makes. You see all of these things. So as you contemplate today those two simple words, I thirst, as they remind you of your own physical thirst, let them also remind you of the spiritual thirst that you should have for Jesus, for his presence, for his being with you. And be reminded that that spiritual thirst is the one that will be fulfilled for eternity. That glass of water you get because you're thirsty after a race will soon need to be replaced by another. Jesus Christ will not. When that thirst is satisfied, that spiritual thirst, it's satisfied for eternity. Well, I want to thank you again for joining me today as I tape this afternoon. It is Thursday. Tomorrow is Good Friday. We will take a look at the sixth saying of Christ from the cross. I hope you choose to join me again tomorrow as we continue contemplating it and as we come to quite literally one of the most important sayings from the cross. Thanks for joining me today.